Evil, falsehood, wrong, and error. Where do they come from? Hello, this is Shores of Infinity with your host Chris speaking. And I assume you are aware that our world is full of error and wrong and evil and falsehood. And where do they come from? Why is that necessary? Can't we just have a perfect world? To find out about that, to find out the truth about this, we have to look below the surface. It's very easy only to see the surface of the water, but what about the depths? Here again, with reality, truth and knowledge and ignorance, we have to look into the deep to find out what is actually happening. And to help with this, I will once more refer to Aurobindo's The Life Divine, this time chapter 13 and 14, and with this we will then have concluded the major part of the summary of the Life Divine, which has not been done before on YouTube or any other medium except live in Aurobindo or the ashram. So there's always talk about how complete, how wise, how absolute the absolute is. The divine or the universe or whatever you want to call it. It's definitely not a person or a being like a person. But it seems to be a force of consciousness and truth and consciousness. Sat Chit Ananda, hard to explain. There seems to be something out there. We just like it to call it God or Goddess or the divine or the gods or whatever, because it's otherwise hard to explain. Or we choose the atheist route and just call it the universe or the universal laws or whatever. It doesn't really matter. There seem to be some laws. Let's put it like this. It's not necessary that someone has created these laws, but there seem to be some laws. And part of these laws seem to result in evil. And evil is an extreme form of ignorance. Two examples. I have probably made them before, but they're very good. Cannibals. Cannibals don't think that they eat other human beings. They just say that those kind of animals they're not human. They're animals, so we can eat them. So some neighboring tribes they will categorize as fellow human beings and others as animals, so they can eat them. Or very famous example in the 1940s in Germany, millions of people were killed with the explanation that they're not human beings, they're subhuman or even vermin or a plague that has to be gotten rid of. So once we warp our perspective into a smaller and more narrow view of reality and just define someone as not being equal to us, that is where evil starts. Also the philosopher Hannah Arendt, she also examined evil and came to the same conclusion. It's a very narrow perspective. It's ignoring the humanity in others. That is what makes evil possible. It's an entitlement. For example, aristocrats in the old days or multi-billionaires nowadays. They just feel entitled, and thus it's no problem to exploit others. It's no problem to walk over corpses on their way to the next million or billion, because they're not equal, so who cares? Well, in actual fact, we're all one. Humanity is one, and there is no separation. The whole separation is what causes ignorance, and thus also, in its last consequence, evil and falsehood. So it's not correct to say there is no falsehood. Often, especially in green and yellow circles, it is said there is no falsehood. I also made this video recently. Is it unspiritual to say that something is not spiritual or less spiritual? No, it's not. there are just things that are wrong and false. There's a famous book by David Hawkins, Truth versus Falsehood, where he even calibrates wars. And wars are often very low on the Hawkins scale. There can be wars with a higher ideal of even 300 or 400, but the war itself, of course, not. Same with the UNO. It has started with very high ideals, but has deteriorated into something else by now. Or religions. Religions usually start out as trying to find out some truth, and then they deteriorate into something horrible. Usually below 200 on the Hawkins scale. And everything below 200 is a result of trauma, and thus leads to a very narrow perspective, and thus leads to ignorance, and thus can lead to evil and falsehood and wrong and error. An example is Tantra. The Tantra that is being taught nowadays is some kind of practice of New Age sexuality. Hawkins calibrates at 95. While the original Tantra in the ancient Indian times calibrates at around 500. This is the difference between desire on the one hand and love on the other hand. So it's a point of view. The trouble is a point of view. And how can you shift your point of view? By surrender. By allowing that you might not be the wisest person on earth. Or the persons you trust might not be the wisest persons on earth. Professors, for example, why should they know what's going on? Look how they live. Just look how people are living and not just how they are talking. Unfortunately, the absolute or the universe or the divine, however you want to call it, cannot and will not communicate to us directly and just explain how things are working. So we have to try to find out by ourselves, and we can do so to a limited degree. Probably not everything, but we can find out much more than we have been taught in schools and by our parents and so on up till now. For trauma therapy you need help, but to find out what truth is, what reality is, what the absolute is, better you do everything by yourself and don't just listen to anyone, also not to some famous gurus. How do you know if they're not talking bullshit and leading you astray? As I've explained in the last video, there is a path which is via your intuition and a psychic being, so you don't need anyone there. You have an inner teacher, an inner master, which you can contact and which will lead you to the psychic being and is the psychic being. Truth is in reality not relative. Again, in our green and yellow thinking, everything is relative. It's not. Well, it is insofar that we have a limited perspective, then everything is relative. If you're only looking at parts of the puzzle, everything is relative. But it is possible to put all the pieces together and complete the puzzle, and then truth is absolute and not relative anymore. To look at a puzzle piece and assign it overly much importance is ignorance and can lead to error, falsehood and evil. So how do we zoom out? That's how Jeffrey Martin calls it, zooming out, and have a bird's eye perspective to see what the puzzle, what the landscape actually looks like. We are so caught in this web of lies that we have been taught is reality that it's very hard to get out of it. How do we get out of it is what Osho was asked. How do we extricate ourselves from this ignorance and evil and separation? One thing is we have to get beyond the material plane, the material sphere or world, which we usually take as the only form of reality. So there's a subtle or vital world, and there's a mental or causal world, and according to Aurobindo, also a supramental world. And this is where we have to go to. We have to explore these other worlds to find the other puzzle pieces. Another question is, are there things like the forces of evil? There's always talk of the powers of light and darkness, good and evil. Is there a thing like that? Like demons or asuras or so, or ghosts, whatever. Are there really evil beings who are trying to stop us? According to Aurobindo and the Mother, yes. I personally very much doubt that. There are beings in the subtle realm who can distract us, but are they really evil beings, like purely evil, as opposed to purely good? This is a very old mythological theme that we find in ancient stories as well as modern stories like Star Wars or many others. Like, for example, the good Jedis versus the bad Siths, the good gods versus the bad Titans. Aurobindo explains that whatever the truth behind this is, it's a problem of life, not of matter. So the answer to this question we can find in the vital sphere, not in the material sphere, where indeed you can find things like that feel like beings, but are not really beings in the way that we usually talk about beings, like plants and animals and human beings. They're different. And Carlos Castaneda talks about that a lot. Those are more like forces of nature. There seem to be destructive powers. There seem to be powers that support war, for example. But from a higher perspective, so what? Even if creation is destroyed, even if the planet is destroyed, something else will be created. It's what makes it so terrible and horrible to us is that we, of course, assign a very high value to our planet and to our lives. But we are not irreplaceable at last. Evil in itself is self-aggrandizement. It doesn't matter if it's a human being or some other thingy being. Self-aggrandizement is a form of separation that is very, very extreme and thus can only lead to hurting others. So on the spiritual path we have to be very careful not to self-aggrandize ourselves, to say that we are better somehow because we are on the spiritual path. That is a very, very big mistake that many gurus have made and are making, and thus they slide back into ignorance. The interesting thing is that evil or falsehood cannot really exist in matter. So this is probably why so many people are fascinated by science and mathematics and so on. If you just observe the laws of the world, of matter, how matter works, then you're not confronted with evil. So actually science may be some kind of trauma response, to flee into science and say, okay, there's no God, there's no evil, there are only universal laws. Everything is fine. Everything can be explained by physics. Evil only comes into being when life comes into being. Without life in pure matter, a stone cannot be evil. But a human being can be evil. An emotion can be evil. A thought can be evil. And an action can be evil. But gravity can't be evil, or an electron, or a quark, or something. Also, this whole thing with separation and duality that comes from the mind. So, we need the mind and we need the life to produce ignorance and evil. To come up with this very stupid idea, ignorant idea of separation. I am separated from the rest. And my life is worth more than the lives of others. That's of course silly, but in truth, that is how most people think and feel. So we are the evil beings here on this planet. Or at least we have the potential for that. We can be, but we don't have to be. So if we kill each other off in a war, so what? Evil kills evil. But according to Aurobindo, of course, we have a job of cosmic evolution of consciousness. We have to get out of this evil maya, out of this falsehood, into the light, towards enlightenment, towards unity. Reunification is what yoga means. Yoga means back to unity. So what do we have that is not matter, not life, and not mind? It's the intuition. The intuition is our way out. Out of ignorance, a wrong consciousness is created. And with this wrong, distorted consciousness, we create this illusion of all the things that we perceive, not knowing that we co-create. We actively participate in Maya, in the upholding of the Maya illusions. And this creates a multitude of misunderstandings and rejections and resistances, and thus can lead to falsehood and evil. Here he actually mentions that the ego might be part of the vital sphere. And we're living in the material sphere most of the time because that is what we assign the most importance to, the highest value. But, as you know, everyone has an ego, everyone has thoughts and emotions, and these are part of the vital sphere. That's, unless we explore the vital sphere, they will have power over us and not the other way around. We need to explore the vital sphere to understand what thoughts and emotions are, and what life is, and what ignorance and unconscious are. Our body is the material being, the material part of our being. And then there's the vital part of our being, which is very strongly associated to the ego and also to most of the ignorance and falsehood going on here. So philosophy and psychology were initially the studies of the vital sphere, maybe even religion, theology. But this has all changed with the rise of the natural sciences like physics and chemistry. Now everything that cannot be measured by machines is labeled imagination. And we assume that doesn't, because it's not real, it cannot have influence over us. But the opposite is true. It has the strongest influence over us, especially if we pretend it doesn't exist or is not as valuable or as real as matter. In truth, we're totally dominated by the vital, by the subtle, and we don't know any way out because we ignore it. But a danger doesn't disappear by ignoring it. Same word root, ignoring and ignorance. The vital force drives towards self-affirmation, he says. So the self-affirmation that we think in our society is the next best thing to sliced bread is actually also part of the whole problem, that we always have to affirm ourselves. Well, I know that too. That's my opinion. I can do this. And based upon this constant need for self-affirmation, we cling to little things and then call them truth. But actually they're falsehood because they're only tiny aspects of the whole. And thus limitation and error and wrong are born. Something is not wrong by itself. It's wrong because it's not enough. It's too small, too tiny. If you can define that the room you're sitting in right now is the whole world. There's nothing outside. This will lead to a lot of trouble sooner or later. You can define it like that, but it's just wrong. And everything based upon this falsehood will lead to more falsehood. And this is how natural science and most other things nowadays in our Western technological modern society is working. So actually everything is worse than it has been 100 years ago at Aurobindo's times. There can be an artificial escape of this problem, which is called religion. But this will only entrap you into more things you just have to believe in without being able to verify them. So both science and religion will not be an escape, will not be a solution. Wrong can only engender more wrong. We have to open up to intuition, and we have to relinquish this idea of division, that we're being separate from others. But how to do that? Aurobindo says we have to do an entire remolding of ourselves, a reshaping, a transformation and transmutation. We cannot solve the problems of matter, mind and life with the ego, with the mind, or with the body. You need something else. You need a new kind of knowledge, which is what he talks about in the next few chapters. Instead of limits, we need integration. That's why he called his method the integral yoga, the integrating path to reunification with the whole. Luckily, this integrated new kind of knowledge is already there. It's already waiting for us. We just have to reach out for it. At the same time, we need this remolding to be a vessel for this new kind of knowledge. But this remolding is also not something that we can do by our bodies and by our minds. It has to come from somewhere else. I say this again and again and again, and people can't hear it. You cannot solve problems of the mind with the mind. Same with the trauma therapy I keep on harping about. You cannot do trauma therapy yourself. On yourself, it's not possible. It's bypassing if you maintain this position. This new knowledge, this new truth is a revelation. It's not something yet you can attain by studying it. It will be revealed to you if you exercise your intuition and if you open and if you stop separating, which is called surrender. You have to surrender to something higher than you are. You have to stop thinking that you are the divine. You are the divine, a part of the divine, but you're not the whole divine. So stop thinking that, please. It's megalomania. It is already in you. You just have to find it. Don't look outwards, look inwards. Thank you for listening, subscribing and liking the video. Thank you for joining me as a patron. Thank you for all my patrons like Gabriel, Sarah, Eric, Alan, Sam, Patrick, Brittany, Chris, Enda, Raghu, Robert, Feike, Bob, Brian, Siam, Björn, Ofi, Mark, Andre, Patricia, Chris, Kelly, Tamash, Goshen, Robina, Gregory, Kim, Alex, Gabriel, Tyler, Daniel, Alex, Kerry, Marcus, Matthias and Thomas. Thank you very much.